Hi everyone, I'm Amy Hamm. Welcome to the Post Millennial podcast. It's just me this week providing some updated commentary about the freedom protests and trucker convoy in Canada. I also wrote an article about what I think is happening in our country and kind of what I think Canadians need to do to move forward. Make sure you check that out. I'll put a link below. Where to start? It's been a very crazy week and a half in this country, and I honestly feel as though I'm reporting from a different Canada than I was in 2 weeks ago. Not in a good way. Absolutely not in a good way. The kind of biggest news to come out of Canada in the last week is that the Liberal government under Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act, which was formerly known as the War Measures Act. And they have used multiple police forces to dismantle the protest/occupation of downtown Ottawa. Downtown Ottawa is now a police-controlled zone. Only residents and selected, i.e. mainstream media, are allowed to enter the area. We have seen Canadians who either donated to or helped to organize the protests. They've had their bank accounts frozen, and organizers have been arrested and denied bail. The reason that people have had their bank accounts frozen is because the Canadian government obtained a list of donors through a hacker who illegally doxed all of the people who contributed to this Give, Send, Go website for the Freedom Convoy. We have also seen mainstream media using the illegally obtained information of citizens to kind of call them up and harass them and ask them what their intentions were, which I think under normal circumstances, it would make sense that a journalist would want to follow up on this information. I would find it unsettling in any circumstance, but especially so because we know that the mainstream media has been lying and they have been towing the line of Justin Trudeau, who is using these protests to divide Canadians and is feeding this false narrative that this is a far-right, white supremacist uprising, which, as far as I'm concerned, is hysterical propaganda. So anyways, we have seen in Canada in 2022, Canadians have had bank accounts frozen. It sounds absolutely insane. I think we've shamed ourselves on the world stage. People are calling Trudeau a tyrant, and frankly, I agree with them. And in the last couple of days in the House of Commons, there was a vote so that Trudeau could continue to use the Emergencies Act in Canada, and he actually won. He has a minority government, so he wouldn't have been able to do so unless he had the backing of the New Democratic Party in Canada. Historically, they have been the party for kind of like the everyman and the worker and the unions and the working poor and the downtrodden. So honestly, they really just threw all of their principles out the window. They threw the working class to the wolves and voted along with Trudeau. They could have triggered an election and toppled the government. Instead, they voted in favor of enabling Trudeau to continue with this which I agree with critics, that it is an unconstitutional power grab. So that's where we are. If we look at how the protest in downtown Ottawa was dismantled, there was some violence, but it actually wasn't from protesters. It was from the police. There was an elderly Indigenous woman who was trampled by an RCMP horse and her clavicle was broken. There were also protesters who were removed from their trucks and from the downtown core at gunpoint. This kind of triggered an argument amongst mainstream journalists who wanted to deny that this had happened. It contradicts their own narrative where they want to smear the truckers as violent white supremacists. But there's video proof that this actually happened. We have this media critic in Canada called Jesse Brown. I usually disagree with a lot of his work. He's quite woke and progressive. But he actually reported on his website about the fact that, yes, it's true, there were protesters who were removed at gunpoint. There's video evidence. And he's catching a lot of flack right now from his own followers And I would have to say I give kudos to him for showing integrity on this issue. The biggest thing that I wanted to convey in my column this week is that I do actually think that there's an emergency in Canada, not one that warrants the invocation of the Emergency Act, and not one that has anything to do with the imminent threat of illegal parking returning to downtown Ottawa. I think the actual emergency in Canada is how completely divided we are, and the fact that we have lost an ability to speak to one another and to bridge any divides. And I don't see us getting out of this mess unless we can agree to engage in good faith and have some proper dialogue. So if you wholesale accept Trudeau's narrative about racists and misogynists and white supremacists, and that this was Canada's January 6th and an attempted insurrection, how can we get anywhere? I think we need to look at the protest and consider the fact that, yes, it turned into an encampment in our capital. And yes, it was difficult for a lot of the residents who lived there. Clearly, it would not be a pleasant environment to live in. I wouldn't like it if this was happening in my backyard either. However, I think we need to recognize that people need to be able to peacefully protest, which it was a peaceful protest. If you have a group of Canadians who feel that your charter protected rights were infringed upon to the extent that to you need to occupy the capital because you think it's that much of a threat to your rights and freedoms, you need an answer. You want to have your prime minister engage in dialogue with you. I think we should assume that the vast majority of protesters who showed up in Ottawa, that was the reason they were there. They were worried about their fundamental rights and freedoms, and they wanted an answer, and they were met with a prime minister who refused to even speak to them and instead responded to their accusing him of being a tyrant, taking away their rights, by acting like a tyrant and taking away even more of their rights. I am personally convinced that every single Canadian has a threshold at which they feel that the type of protest that we just saw in Ottawa would be acceptable. And if we are to take it on good faith, that this is the reason that the freedom protests and the truckers descended on Ottawa, that their threshold was met, we should understand that an appropriate response by Trudeau's government would be to enter into a dialogue with them and to work towards a solution, not to ignore them, to disappear, and then to name call, to throw gas on the fire, and then to invoke the Emergencies Act and prove to them that he is in fact the tyrant that they were accusing him of being. This was never about white supremacists. This was never about Nazis. And at this point, it's not even about vaccine mandates or COVID restrictions anymore. It has morphed into something even bigger. At this point, it's about our very democracy and just this huge divide in our country and how we are going to bridge this divide. I honestly feel as though Canada is falling apart and that Canadians, each and every one of us, has a civic duty at this point to try to engage in dialogue rather than to just embrace the politics of division. I'll be back next week with some more commentary, and I am still afraid. I was afraid last week. I didn't know what was going to happen. I honestly felt that there might be more violence than there was, so I'm grateful that it was kept to a minimum. But my mind is not at ease, and I am worried about the fate of Canada. Thank you everyone for tuning in. As always, leave some comments below with feedback. Let me know what you think or what you would like to hear about. I love to hear it. Thank you.